Welcome learners, I am back with your Module 45A in the 12th week of your learning this 3 months refresher course in environmental education for teacher training institutions on the Swayam platform offered by the NRC of the Aligarh Muslim University. In the earlier modules, I have done with you a great deal of what is sustainable development and what are the ethics involved for dealing with sustainable development. The module 45A that we are going to study today is a part of your 12th week of study, and this module is based on biodiversity, especially developing sensitivity through teacher education. Now, before we go ahead with the complete theme of biodiversity and developing sensitivity through teacher education, we will look at what is biodiversity and why it is important to conserve biodiversity. Friends, the very definition of biodiversity says that biodiversity means the variability among living organisms from all sources, including inter alia, terrestrial, marine and other aquatic ecosystems, and the ecological complexes of which they are a part. This includes diversity within species, between species and of ecosystems. Now, in this definition, there are certain terms that need to be explained. Variability means different types. Living organisms includes everything living. Terrestrial is the land environment, which also includes the inland water bodies. Marine and other ecosystems includes the oceans, the seas, etc. And as you know, ecology and ecosystem denotes the interactions between the biotic and the abiotic factors, where biotic means living factors, whereas abiotic means non-living factors of any environment. Species of different types of organisms, they are housed in ecosystems, and all species are formed by a particular genetic information. Hence, biological diversity includes diversity within species, between species and of ecosystems. Now, as you can see, the term biological diversity is a contraction of two terms, biological and diversity. Hence, the word biodiversity, a contraction of biological diversity. Now, what is biological? As you know, all living organisms, plants as well as animals, are considered as biological species, and diversity is the variation between species. Hence, biological diversity refers to the numbers, variety and variability of living organisms and ecosystems. It includes all terrestrial, marine and other aquatic organisms, as I have explained earlier, all plants and animals that are found in water, outside water, on land, in oceans, in seas and in all inland water bodies. Biodiversity covers the diversity within species, between species as well as variation among ecosystems. Now, this definition of biological diversity may not be the correct, accurate, precise and absolute definition of biological diversity, but this by all means is the most widely accepted definition of biological diversity. This was adopted in 1992 when the Convention on Biological Diversity, which is an international convention under the banner of the United Nations, was signed by 150 countries in 1992, and the occasion was the Global Earth Summit that was held at Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. Now, this was the largest ever summit that was held, organized and attended by maximum number of heads of states, and they had all sat down together to find out ways, means and measures for the survival of humanity in the wake of environmental devastation. The Agenda 21 for the 21st century was chalked out as part of this convention, the deliberations of this convention in June 1992 at Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. And one important outcome of this convention was the Convention on Biological Diversity, signed in 1992, which is also known as the CBD, Convention on Biological Diversity. According to this convention, all the 150 nations of the world, they came to the conclusion that biodiversity should be conserved, and together the international community should be doing something for conserving biodiversity. Now, why do we have so much diversity on the planet Earth? Scientists have been studying the patterns of diversity, and they have proposed several causes behind the emergence of such immense species diversity. One is habitat stress, under which organisms have to adapt to the conditions, the environment and the climate of their particular habitat. Second is geographical isolation, because of which organisms in a particular place are isolated and they evolve in a unique manner. One more reason is dominance by a single species, the availability of ecological niches, the edge effect and the geological history. These are the reasons behind this mind-boggling diversity of plants and animals and microorganisms on our planet. Now, biodiversity is of three types. We have the first level of diversity, and that is called genetic diversity. Now, as you know, we are what we are because of the genes that we have inherited from our parents, and these genes decide and determine the characters in our phenotype, that is our outside physicality, and in our genotype, that is the genetic information that we are capable of passing on to the coming generations. Now, as you can see, because of the DNA, because of the chromosomes and the characters that are embedded on these chromosomes and the DNA, within species there are different types of physical forms as well as different types of characters. There are so many types of, you can see, colors and shapes and sizes of bananas, although bananas are a single species. Similarly, you can see there are so many different colors and shapes and sizes, as well as properties related to yield and nutritional value. In maize, this is possible only because of the genetic diversity. So, genetic diversity is the primary progenitor of species diversity. Now, in this slide you can see that there is immense diversity. We have thousands of types of birds, hundreds of mammals, lakhs and lakhs of insects, so many types of reptiles, millions of plants, and that's how our planet, our ecosystem has become rich in different types of species. Now, please mind it that when I am saying one species, I mean human beings are one species, that is Homo sapiens. Similarly, the tiger is another species, that means Panthera tigris. The rice that we eat is just another single species, which is called Oryza sativa. All the different types of birds, I am sure you would have seen the beautiful sparrow coming to your garden or to your courtyard, thronging in flocks. It is called Passer domesticus and it is just one species. So, because of genetic diversity, we have species diversity, and our earth thankfully is very, very rich in different types of species. And finally, we have ecosystem diversity. Now, as you know, ecosystem is one set of natural habitat where interactions between biotic and abiotic factors are going on continuously, and the process of life and regeneration of life is supported in the ecosystems. Now, because there are different types of ecosystems, as you can see, there are ecosystems that are forests, there are ecosystems that are grasslands, ecosystems that are deserts, ecosystems that are mountains, ecosystems that are aquatic in nature. We have different types of rivers, we have different types of ponds and lakes, peats, bogs, marshes, and then we have so many types of marine ecosystems in the oceans and in the seas. Now, all these ecosystems have variable set of biotic and abiotic factors. They have variable set of climatological, geological and geographical conditions, and based on this they support a different type of life, a different type of species diversity. So, when we have good ecosystem diversity, we have good species diversity, and hence we have good genetic diversity. And I must add here that the total gene pool of the earth is the primary treasure of life sustenance on the planet Earth. Now, similarly, there are three scales of diversity. They are called alpha diversity, beta diversity and gamma diversity. As you can see, as altitudinal changes occur in land, so does the type of flora and fauna of the place changes. So, alpha diversity is the diversity within the habitat, beta diversity is the diversity between the habitats, and gamma diversity is the total diversity of the biosphere. So, now we will look at the value of biodiversity. You can imagine very well, man is not born as an island. To survive on the planet, man has to continuously interact with other cohabitants of the planet. And what are these cohabitants? These are the other organisms, the other species, the plants, the animals and the microbes that sustain life for us. But when we look deeply, the values of biodiversity are multifarious. Basically, there are two types of biodiversity values. the direct use values and the indirect use values. Under the direct use values, there are consumptive and productive use values, and under the indirect use values, there are social and cultural values, ethical values, aesthetic values and optional values. Now, we will look at them one by one. Under consumptive use value, there are such products of nature that we need for our survival, that we take from nature and that we consume, in which the first is all types of food. Second is many building material for certain communities in the villages and in the forests as tribals. The consumptive use value of biodiversity is also that of fuel wood and fodder for the local communities. There are many fishing communities that get fish from the water bodies, and then all the medicines that we actually go to nature and take for our consumption. The second type of direct use value is productive use value. This category comprises marketable goods, genetically modified crops and animals, pharmacological uses for new drugs identification from plant or animal products, and for industrialists, biodiversity is a rich storehouse to develop new products. So, you have seen these were the two direct use values of biodiversity. These are the various types of products that can be made by taking raw material from biodiversity. Now, we come to the other indirect uses of plants and animals. New species of plants and animals are being constantly discovered in the wild. These wild species are the building blocks for the betterment of human life, and their loss is a great economic loss to mankind. Now, we come to the indirect use values. In this, the first is social use value. Many plants and animals have immense significance in various cultures and civilizations, and they are also used as religious symbols. Biodiversity also has ethical and moral values. Ethical values of biodiversity are based on the importance of protecting all forms of life. Man is only a small part of the Earth's great family of species. Plants and animals have an equal right to live and exist on our planet. Most religious and secular creeds believe that all forms of life have the right to exist on Earth. Then comes the aesthetic use value. You will understand that all inspiration from beauty is drawn by nature. Inspiration for color combinations, inspiration for shapes, sizes, proportions, they are all coming from the golden mean in nature. So, aesthetic value of biodiversity is the pure enjoyment that biodiversity offers to human beings. Quite apart from killing wildlife for food, it is also important as a tourist attraction, and nature gives all inspiration for the creative work. And the final indirect use value is optional value, keeping future possibilities open. That is why their use is called optional value. It is impossible to predict which of our species or traditional varieties of crops and domestic animals will be of greatest use in the future. Future that we have not seen, but future in which our coming generations will survive. To improve cultivars and domestic livestock, we need to return to wild relatives of crop plants and the animals. So, if we want to keep our options open for future development, for future economic growth, for future health security, We have to preserve the gene pool of the earth because we don't know which gene or which cultivar could have immense possibilities and promise for, say for example, the cure of a disease, or say for example, the development of a new cultivar that would mean solving the world food crisis. So, as of now, there are many species who do not have a consumptive or a productive use value, but in future their gene pool may be required for some kind of medicine or for some kind of development of a high yielding crop, and hence to keep our options open for future growth, for future well-being and for future development, we need to keep biodiversity safe and the gene pool conserved. That is why we have the gene bank principle. Hybrids are a result of crossbreeding originally from wild species. I will give you the example of the donkey and of the chicken that we eat. Now, the donkey has its ancestor in the wild ass, which is called Equus khur, and the chicken has its ancestor in the red jungle fowl, which is called Gallus gallus. So, the greater the diversity of wild stocks, the greater is the opportunity for the production of new varieties. These days, we hear a lot about bird flu. Now, imagine if because of bird flu, all the chicken in the poultry farms have to be destroyed, because sometimes they have to be incinerated because bird flu is very, very dangerous for human health also, then where will we get the breed or the variety for new farm bred chicken if its wild ancestor, the Gallus gallus or the red jungle fowl in the forests, is not preserved? So, this is the gene bank principle of biodiversity, and this rests on hybrids that are the origin for new varieties and immense potentialities for economic growth. The optional use value can be thought of again as an insurance for the future. Man's needs keep changing. Hybrids may produce higher yields. Although hybrids are not as robust as wild ancestors, but they may be resistant to epidemic or climate variation, and resistant strains in wild relatives maintain opportunities for further breeding and crossbreeding. So, preserving the gene pool of the earth is like an insurance for the future. But sadly, today, for the many reasons that we have also seen when we were doing the earlier modules and looking at sustainable development, species extinction, that is the extirpation of populations of species, is rampant. Man is only a strand in the delicate web of life on earth. Every time a species is extinct, a strand is snapped and man moves closer to doom. Species are dependent on each other and they must find ways of coexistence instead of one species dominating the resources and the land so much that the other species have to face competitive elimination. So, if not then there will be no life on earth. Now, many scientists also debate that extinction is a natural process, that earlier on also in the geological history of earth there have been many mass extinctions. That is why today we do not have dinosaurs, but this is a very short-sighted supposition. Extinction is a natural phenomenon and it makes little difference to man if a few species go extinct. This is the short-sighted supposition. However, the explanation to this is that species are components of ecosystems which constitute the earth, and to the extent that ecosystem is vital to man's extinction, species are equally vital. This is the concept of spectrum of species. Biodiversity today in the present age is a spectrum, just like a spectrum of rays, and its completeness lies in the coexistence and the survival of all species, including man. Secondly, the explanation for this short-sighted supposition is this, that all the past extinctions have been natural, whereas extinctions of species that are taking place today are man-made, and they are because of anthropocentric activities. Another reason is that these extinctions today are very, very hastened, and the pace of extinctions is not natural. Hence, despite this extinction debate, we have to be worried about biodiversity depletion. We share the earth with 3 to 5 million species of flora and fauna. Today, one vertebrate species disappears every 9 months, and the rate of extinction may be between 40 to 100 species per day. Loss of biodiversity also robs the earth of its gene pool preservation, which keeps mankind prepared to take the challenges of the unknown hidden in the capricious future. So 1.4 million species have been identified. That means we know them by their characters, we know them by their scientific name and classification, we know them by their distribution, and we also know them by their conservation status. However, there are scientists who believe that there may be close to 10 million species. That means a very large section of species has not even been identified. New species are being discovered, and at any given time this diversity is not static, because evolutionary changes are taking place continuously on a time resource continuum. This diversity is not the same everywhere on earth. Distinct geographic patterns owing to climate and environment are observed. Now, there are two terms related to biodiversity, and these are richness and diversity. Together, the two constitute a high index of biodiversity. Very simply, richness is a high number of species. Two areas, for example, A and B, one with 20 species has good richness as compared to B if it has only 10 species. However, diversity is an index of the richness as well as evenness of the distribution of species. Suppose, for example, there is habitat A and there is habitat B. In both the habitats, there are 20 species. That means the richness of both the habitats is equal. However, to see whether the biodiversity of both the habitats is equal or not, we have to look into the evenness of these species. Suppose habitat A has 20 species of only mammals, whereas habitat B has 5 species of birds, 5 of insects, 5 of reptiles, 5 of fish. In that case, we will consider that habitat with several types of species, several groups of species is more diverse than the habitat which has equal number of species but a monotonous representation of the class. So, in order to have good biodiversity, we need to have good richness as well as good evenness. However, owing to large scale changes in how man is making use of land, the destruction of habitat has become the leading cause of current species extinctions. It has resulted from the expansion of human populations and activities. Historically, the largest cause of land transformation has been the expansion of agricultural lands to meet the needs of a growing population. The destruction of tropical rainforests has become almost synonymous with declining biodiversity. On a global scale, 140,000 square kilometer of tropical rainforest is being lost each year. Now, owing to this, a global exercise of evaluating species and of assigning them a critical or endangered or vulnerable status of threat has been taken up by the IUCN. Now, IUCN is the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, and it has developed a quantitative classification system on the basis of these three levels. IUCN has evaluated 27,000 species so far, and it has grouped them in several categories, and these categories are that of critically endangered, endangered and vulnerable species. Now, what are critically endangered species? Those species that face a risk of extinction, that is 20% probability of extinction in 20 years or 5 generations. The endangered species, they face 50% probability of extinction in 10 years or 3 generations, whichever is longer. And the vulnerable species, they face 10% or greater probability of extinction in 100 years. So, given how many species have joined the categories of threat according to IUCN, it is important that we save biodiversity. There are several arguments as to why we should save biodiversity. In a next module, you will study the various conservation measures for biodiversity, how we can make protected areas, how we can make seed banks and gene banks, what is in situ conservation and what is ex situ conservation. These are all measures of protecting biodiversity. Today, we will only focus at why we should conserve biodiversity. Let us look at the 3 reasons. First, there is the economic argument, then there is the genetic argument, and then there is the ethical argument, which is at the core and which is the most important. Friends, it is very easy to convince anyone of the protection of biodiversity when we state the economic value, the productive use value and the consumptive use value, the optional use value, etc. for the protection of biodiversity. However, there is a genetic argument too, and this genetic argument lies in the fact that evolution of species is taking place every single moment. You can imagine all the species that exist today, they have evolved from their ancestors. Those who do not exist except in the fossil records, the paleontological and the paleobotanical records, that's how we know of them, but it is a fact that if they were not there, we wouldn't have been here today. So, because the present day species are the ancestors of future species, we have to preserve the present day species, because if we do not preserve them, the evolutionarily changed future species will also not have a chance to occur. However, you may not care about it, but you would certainly care about it when it comes to the ethical argument, ethics, something about which he or she is philosophically convinced, ethics. Now, as part of teacher education programs and as part of the daily conduct of student educators, it is very important that biodiversity conservation issues are integrated with education, especially at the primary levels when the students come with very young, fresh and impressionable minds. And as part of their daily lessons, if concerns for biodiversity are ingratiated with what they are learning, then they will evolve and come out, develop to be very sound individuals who will make responsible decisions. However, today the problem is, and here I will quote something important that was said by the father of the modern conservation biology movement, Aldo Leopold, whom I have also quoted earlier in his landmark book, the one and only book that he wrote, Sand County Almanac. He says, no important change in ethics was ever accomplished without any internal change in our intellectual emphasis, loyalties, affections and convictions. The proof that conservation has not yet touched these foundations of conduct lies in the fact that philosophy and religion have not yet heard of it. Now, this is such a profound quote by this great thinker and conservation biologist, because today, to conserve the environment, to protect biodiversity is not the responsibility of a certain small group of people, or it is not the responsibility of science alone. You can see there are social problems for which science has an answer. Say for example, there were different types of diseases like malaria, like jaundice, like cholera and like tuberculosis, but the invention of drugs like antibiotics, they were a solution to these social problems arising because of people getting contracting diseases, contamination because of contamination, contagious diseases and people dying. But science gave the answer. Drugs were invented and today nobody who gets a proper treatment dies of tuberculosis or dies of cholera, because these are diseases that can be controlled by antibiotics. There are many social problems that have been solved by science. Society looks up to science for many of its social problems. However, the conservation of biodiversity is one area where science has its limitations. It is impossible for science to conserve biological diversity. All that science can do is to identify the species that are under threat, the species that need to be conserved, and to be able to tell as to what needs to be done to protect them. However, the responsibility lies with the larger society on the whole to conserve the biodiversity as instructed by science. So, one of the important discussion points of this lesson could be that there are two different approaches for protecting biodiversity. One is the species-centric approach and the other is the habitat-centric approach. Some scientists believe that we can focus on the species and preserve it, whereas others believe that in order to preserve the species, we have to preserve the entire ecosystem. So, this is a discussion point for you. You can think, apply your mind and come out with arguments in favor or disfavor of these two approaches, the species-centric and the ecosystem-centric. Friends, I would like to introduce this activity with you for this particular lesson. You can do it with your students also, because as you know, activity-based learning is always important for energizing and motivating the minds of the students. the more they interact with knowledge that will help them become good, responsible citizens with the right kind of ethics to conserve biodiversity. In India, the record of species is maintained by the Ministry of Environment, Forests and Climate Change as part of the schedules of the Wildlife Protection Act, which was passed in 1972 to check poaching and trade. Now, the activity you are being given is to go to their website and check the Schedule 1, Schedule 2, Schedule 3 and Schedule 4 species and see if there are any species of your region that are listed in any of these schedules. I hope this will give you a greater interaction time with biodiversity, with species of plants and animals, with non-human species, species that you may overlook, but species that are very important for our own survival. Thank you so much. We look forward to learning about grading and success stories for green cities and for good urban biodiversity areas in our next module, that will be the module 45B. Thank you and happy learning.